if you have an outline in front of you, you will see at the top, it does not talk about chapter 20, it talks about chapter 19. And there's a reason for that. We've said this a handful of times throughout this study that these chapter and verse things are later additions to the scriptures. They're not part of the original scriptures, either in Greek New Testament or Hebrew Old Testament. They are a convenience. They are something for ease for people to go ahead and flip what became a printed volume of a book. But in the ancient world, these did not exist in a book. They existed on a scroll. And it was so common, especially for Jews, to have scrolls opened so often in a synagogue that they kind of visually knew where on the scroll what they were looking for was. And so they didn't really need chapters and verses. It was a later addition. And I tell you all that and remind you all of that because I think the split between chapter 19 and 20 actually did us a disservice. And I'm going to tell you why. One of the things that Matthew likes to do is he likes to use these bookend teachings. I call them story sandwiches. So what he'll do is he'll make a point, that's like one slice of bread, and then it will seemingly stop, and then there will be a whole bunch of teaching, and then he will write or say, or Jesus will quote something almost exactly the same as the first piece. And we're going to see that in real life here in a second. And so what Matthew is doing is trying to alert readers, and this is a technique in the ancient world that people understood, that what is written in between the two pieces of bread and the sandwich is really the explanation. It's the illustration of what those things mean. So let me give you an example. The end of chapter 19, it starts with this question of Peter, because Peter is concerned that he has given up an awful lot to follow Jesus. You remember this scene from last week? So he's a little bit concerned that he's like, I've left stuff behind for you. Is there something in it for me? And Jesus says in the end of 19, he says, everyone who's left all these things behind for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Now I put a little footnote there because that phrase, this is the first time Jesus has said that phrase. So he says, the first will be last, and vice versa. So this is the first time Jesus has said that. Now, if you've never heard this phrase before and somebody comes up to you and says, hey, many who are first will be last and the last will be first, what is your first question going to be? Yeah, about what? Or what does that mean? Right? Well, unfortunately, the Bible cut us off right here and said that's the end of chapter 19, and so kind of the Western reader says, oh, one chapter over, new chapter beginning. We are the chapter book culture, right? And so we just think, oh, one story's over, now let's start a new story. The problem is I think the reader has a question. What on earth does that mean? And the story that Jesus says or teaches in the beginning of what we know as chapter 20 is the explanation to what does that mean. And Matthew tips us off because at the end of the section, it is in Matthew chapter 20, verse 16. It's the end of this first parable. You could flip the page and see, what does verse 16 say? The last will be first. And yes, so he has bookended it, and he has tried to alert us that this stuff that we're about to read is the answer to the question, what does it mean that the last will be first and the first will be last? Are you guys tracking with me? Okay, so this is like brilliant stuff. I understand fully that the Bible is a living spiritual document, but one thing that I just can't wrap my mind around is people who don't even believe in Jesus should at least be able to come to this and say like, whoa, this is incredible writing. Do you guys see this technique, how brilliant this is? This is like, make sure you don't get it. And if you didn't know what you were reading, I'm going to say it again so you don't miss it. This is brilliant writing. This is what happens when God empowers somebody to write his word, wouldn't you say? Okay, so let's answer this question together. What does it mean for the first to be last and the last to be first? And of course, Jesus, he is not in the business of just coming out and telling you what it means. He's going to tell us a parable. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. Let's pause right here. If you're taking notes and you kind of know the story, what do you guys know is going to happen? Okay, he's going to get more laborers. So one of the first things I want us to know is that the first group of laborers come at the beginning of the workday. In the Roman Empire, and even prior to that, the workday starts at 6 a.m. and it stops at 6 p.m. This is a 12-hour workday, and it's more or less loosely based on when the sun comes up and when the sun goes down. Right? And of course, some seasons are longer and some are shorter, but this is the harvest season. This is a full 12-hour workday. And so when we read something like at the third hour, that just means the third hour after the sun rises, so that would be 9 a.m. So we're going to read that. The next thing I want you to know is this, is that of all the groups of people who Jesus, or the master, invites to come work into his field, this is the only group that it says more or less agree or negotiate their pay. And they agree to a denarius. We're going to talk a little bit about it in a second. I did some reading on denarius, about what its value was and lots of stuff like that, and I'll tell you what I learned this week in a little while. But a denarius for right now, the important thing is that it's basically a social contract in the Roman world, that this is what you pay an unskilled worker for a day's worth of work. 1 denarius. This is not exactly, but let's think of it as like minimum wage. So if somebody says, hey, I want to hire you in the vineyard, the assumption is that a denarius is just going to be my pay. So if somebody says, I can only pay you half of that, that is an indication to you that that's not the social contract in the world of honor and shame. So if somebody's not willing to pay you this, then they are bringing shame upon their entire household. Does that make sense? So a denarius is just common. Everybody says, yep, that's the wage. We agree to it, it says. And he sent them into the vineyard. Verse 3. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, you go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you. Okay, so we got these guys, they're just standing idle in the marketplace. So they've been standing there since 6 a.m., hoping somebody will pick them up and give them some work, right? They have no guaranteed income. They have no ability to make money except for their labor. And so they linger around the marketplace for 3 hours. They've already been passed over once. Maybe many masters of vineyards have come in. They've picked maybe the strongest, most healthy-looking guys, said, come on, let's go work. And these guys got left behind. 3 hours later, Jesus says, the master comes back and says, hey, you need to go in the vineyard too. And check this out. Whatever is right, I will give you. Now, this is one of those things that I immediately just kind of brushed over and just thought, oh, that's interesting. And I started to read and think about it, and I realized that for somebody to not negotiate their pay for a chunk of a day, not a full day, is kind of a leap of faith. Would you agree? How many of you would say, if somebody came to you and said, hey, I need you to do 9 hours of hard labor for me, how many of you, your first question or one of your first questions would be, I'm willing to, but what are you paying? How many of you would say that? Okay, so we find out immediately these people don't bother to ask, which is very interesting. What Jesus is speaking to is he's speaking to a culture that exists 100% on the scale of honor and shame. We've talked about this a lot. This is kind of your social equity, if you will. And so when we hear that this guy says, hey, I need you to go into my vineyard for 9 hours, at the end of the day, I'll pay you whatever is right, what Jesus is saying to the original listeners is that this master has incredibly high honor. He has incredibly high reputation, enough so that a worker knows who he is and would agree to go work for him without understanding what the actual pay would be. Because he knows this person is so honorable, they'll do the right thing and they'll do right by me. Does that make sense? Okay. So 3 hours later, we're talking about 9 a.m., a new group goes into the vineyard. Whatever is right, I will give you. Verse 5, so they went. But going out again about the 6th hour, so what time is it now? Noon. And the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m., he did the same. So he just did exactly the same. Hey, I need you to go into my vineyard. And at the end of the day, I'll pay you whatever is right. I'll take care of it. And they go. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" Now this is an interesting question. How long have these people been standing here? 11 hours. How many of you would sit around knowing there's only 1 hour left of daylight and decide, I'm just going to stick it out? You know, I personally, I kind of feel like, okay, you didn't get picked up the first time around. Maybe you wait till 9 or 10 a.m. and then might as well just go home and make yourself useful and try again tomorrow, right? So there's this element. There's two things going on. I think number one, I think the original listeners would have heard this and thought, oh, this is at the very peak of the harvest. Because in the ancient world, there's no refrigeration, there's no heavy machinery. Every single thing has to be done by hand or with an animal. And so when the grapes of a vineyard are ready to make mostly wine, and wine is a very lucrative product in the ancient world, when it's ready now. It needs to come off the vine like right now. And so what is this master doing? He's getting as many people as he could possibly find to fill his vineyard and go do the work, right? So this is one element of the story I think people would pick up on. This master is urgent to get this field harvested. The second thing is you're left scratching your head. Who on earth stands around and gets passed over and over again and just hangs out in the marketplace for 11 hours knowing there's only 1 hour of daylight left? What kind of person would do that? Maybe someone who fought with their wife the night before and doesn't want to go home? Okay, think about it. So a denarius, this is the common wage for a day's worth of labor. We're going to talk a little bit about it, but what is your understanding of what a denarius is worth? Minimum wage, more or less, right? So you got a family, maybe you got a couple kids. What do you need that money for? Survival, yeah. So you are desperate. There's an inkling of desperation that I have no choice. Are the chances high that someone's going to hire me? No. But I have to risk it. I have nothing to lose. I have only something to gain, right? There's people depending on me. And so there's this element built into the story. So there's this urgency. So let me make sure I'm checking off all the boxes here. Okay, so these people are in desperate need of work. All we know so far, if we've never heard this story before, is that the first group, who has now worked a 12-hour day, is promised a denarius. The rest were left thinking, again, brilliant writing, you got to keep reading, well, how much is he going to pay them? Right? And so we're going to find out what kind of boss this master is. Is he a good boss? Is he a bad boss? I think the answer is it depends on when you entered the vineyard. Okay. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages." Now listen to this. Matthew doesn't want you to miss what he's trying to teach you, what Jesus is teaching. Beginning with the last up to the first. What does that sound like? Those who are first will be last. What is he doing? He's sprinkling it in there to make sure you're connecting the dots and you're not missing it. This parable is the answer to what that means, right? Okay, so he says, I want you to start with the last. So who are the last? These are the people who only worked an hour, right? These are the people who entered at 5 p.m. It's now 6 p.m. Workday is over. I want you in the pay line. I want them to line up first. Now, if they're lining up first, what is Jesus setting up in this parable? What is going to be witnessed by everyone? They're going to see in descending order what the master of this vineyard pays the workers first for a 1 hour of work, 3 hours of work, 6 hours of work, 9 hours of work, and a full day of work. And the people who entered the vineyard first are going to be in the back of the line, and they're going to get to see what he pays the first. I want you to notice that, because as this story unfolds, had we done it the opposite, where the people who are first in the vineyard get paid first, they could have taken their pay, which is how much? A denarius, and then they could have just exited. And the entire story would be in some ways not making any sense. So he lines them up in this way on purpose. Okay, so he says, at the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. But when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, 'These last only worked 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.'" How many of you are feeling for them a little bit? If you're honest, how many of you are okay, I was trying to think. So often we read parables and we kind of scratch the surface, and I was trying to think, what would it be like if we tried our best to translate this parable to 2022? So I came up with a couple things, and I want to tell you, this is pure speculation. I read like 8 or 10 different sources, and they're all over the place, but there's kind of a smattering of people who are more or less in the same ballpark about how much a denarius would be worth in the 21st century. So a denarius is hard to pin down, and there's a couple reasons. We keep hearing news stories about inflation. Anybody heard that or felt that lately? The Roman Empire is like the king of inflation. So this denarius that they're holding in their hand, depending on when they're living in Rome, 5-year gaps, it could be worth 5 times more, and then 5 years later it could be worth almost nothing. This is how inflation works. So it's very hard to pin this down. I just tell you that to say that this is pure speculation, but there are some experts who are kind of like, this is the ballpark. The ballpark is something around like $40 or $60 is what we would translate that to. So all I did is said, you know what, let's just pretend it's $50. That seems like a reasonable amount. It's right in what experts who know more than I do say that this is probably about worth. And I just broke it down. This is footnote 5. So if you worked a full 12-hour day, that would mean that you made about $4.15 an hour. Now, if you're like a math whiz and you're crunching numbers in your head, I rounded to the nearest nickel, so don't come at me with, it's actually $4.13 with 3 ongoing forever. A 9-hour day is roughly $5.50 an hour. 6 hours, you made about $8.35 an hour, still below California minimum wage, right? A 3-hour day, you made about $16.65 an hour, which is about what Del Taco is paying now, which is crazy. And a 1-hour day, you made $50 an hour. How many of you, if you were on this pay scale, would like to be the guy who worked 1 hour and made $50? I think we're going to get there and figure out what is this parable talking about, but I think what Jesus is trying to communicate to us is that we are the 1 hour. We are the 1 hour crew. We made $50 an hour. But we also have to come to grips with these people are upset. Because if you were sitting at your job in your workplace and you found out that there's this guy, he comes in at 1 p.m. every day, he never gets in trouble even though he should be there at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. And then you come to find out that he makes as much money as you even though he doesn't do anything. He just slacks off and plays, cell phone games the whole day with his feet up on the desk. How many of you would be frustrated by that? Would you be a little frustrated? And you would feel like, if it were me, I would feel like that is not fair. Okay? That is a human idea. The other idea that I thought was, I think that people should get what they deserve. That's another kind of concept. And I think these are part of human nature. These two things, I think, are part of human nature. And if you're following along the biblical story, then you will know that human nature is sinful. And I think there's a part of this story that Jesus wants to tell you that these are not concepts that come from God. And I think that he would also say if you wanted to play by those rules, it would be very, very bad for you. If you wanted God to treat you fairly based on the work you have done or give you what you deserve, what would the Bible say would be your pay? Death. Yeah, death. That's like the nice way of saying, yeah. I think that's what the Bible is saying. But I think what Jesus is touching on is this is a human desire to be treated fairly and get what I deserve. So let's read and figure out what's going on here. So they're upset, they're grumbling, because they say in their own words, you've made them equal to us. Now I want you to notice that verbiage. They're not saying that we're upset just because you paid them the same. They're saying you made them equal. You put us on the same level. Now we're going to talk in a second about what's going on in this parable, but I think we can piece it together a little bit. I think that a part of what's happening here is that the first into the vineyard are the Jews. That's what Jesus is teaching. In some part, the first in the vineyard are the Jews. And we know if we keep reading the New Testament, how many of the Jewish converts are just totally okay with Gentiles becoming Christians and being treated exactly the same as them? No. In, I think it's Galatians, Paul has to address this situation where Jewish converts to Christianity are like, these Gentiles, they have to be circumcised. I don't even want to eat at the table with them. I don't care if they belong to Jesus or not. They're not the real thing. This is the kind of conflict that they have. So I think what Jesus is addressing is there are people who feel like they've been in the vineyard, they've been in the scorching heat, they've been heirs to the promise for generations. How come these people are being treated the same? And this is what Jesus says. But he replied to one of them, "Friend." Now, how often does Jesus or anybody in the Bible refer to somebody as this word? Is this common or relatively uncommon? Relatively uncommon. This word is a term of endearment and intimacy. So what the master of the vineyard is doing is he's addressing someone who's been in the vineyard a long time, and he addresses them with this term that means like familiarity. We know each other. We're not just acquaintances. There's something about this word is not like you just rendered a service as a laborer in the vineyard. You are somebody that has a relationship with me, and Jesus addresses him that way. Or I'm sorry, the master. We haven't got there yet. The master addresses him, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius?" Oh, that old thing where we agreed upon it, right? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last worker as I give to you. It's my choice. Why? Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? That phrase, I don't know what your versions say, but that I am not allowed to, that's a legal term. He's saying that I legally have the right to do whatever I want with what belongs to me. What belongs to you is the denarius I just handed to you, which is fair because we agreed upon it. It's fair because that's the long-standing contract of the entire empire. You got what was fair. What happened to others is of no consequence to you. I have the legal right to do whatever I want with what belongs to me. Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Okay, so there's the other side of the sandwich, right? So let's talk a little bit about this. I thought it was interesting. It's probably not worth going into depth, but this idea of, my ESV version says, you begrudge my generosity. It's a really interesting, I think some of your versions kind of preserve just the literal words. What do your versions say if you have a Bible open, by the way?
Envious.
Are you envious because I am jealous?
Okay, so they translate it as envious. Okay? My ESV says you begrudge me. Anybody have like New King James or NASB or something like that? I think I put those down here. It says, let's see, the NASB says your eye is envious, so it has something to do with your eye. The New King James actually I think has the most literal, it's an evil eye. I didn't know this, but the idea of, you know, like the stink eye, or people say like, oh, I got the evil eye. You guys heard that before? It turns out that comes from like a 5th or 6th century BC Greek drama. And the idea was that if somebody had like the enchantment of the gods and they gave you the evil eye, they could like put a spell on you. So it just became like part of the idioms. People just said it. And the idea is you put the evil eye on me, like there's something about me that you despise and you would wish evil upon me. Does that make sense? Kind of an interesting thought. Okay, so I think this is what's going on with these workers. The reason I think this is what's going on is I think that in large part Jesus is addressing human nature and how we think it works versus what he's offering us. And I think these workers are grumbling because they want one of two things to happen. And I think this is something that we, if we're honest, would want for us. I think when the guys who have worked 12 hours notice that the person who only worked less than 10% of what I worked got paid the same, I think they want either, number one, they want a pay raise. Right? How How many of you would say, I just found out my coworker does 10% of the work and we get paid the same, I should get a raise? How many of you would say, yep, I would ask for it? Or they would say, you know what, we did agree to the 1 denarius. How about you just give them 10% of a denarius? So you either want a pay raise for yourself or you want a pay cut for your... That's what kind of is going on. And Jesus says, your thoughts on how this works are irrelevant to me, because what belongs to me, I am free to do whatever I want with, whether it makes sense to you or not. So I think what's going on is at the core, this is not just Jesus showing impartiality. I think that's what they think he's doing. Because they say, you have made them equal to us. What I think Jesus is really saying is I think he is speaking that what he has is an abundance of grace, and he gets to divvy it out how he sees fit. They're worried about how they're being treated in comparison to others, and Jesus is saying this isn't about a comparison. This is about me being so generous that I would give out of my abundance. Okay, so let's talk about kind of what the parable really means. And of course, we can't always just draw lines and say this character in the parable equals this character and X, Y, and Z, but I think we can kind of build a puzzle. So I started asking some questions, and I think the first question is this, is who is willing to work? In the ancient world, knowing what you know about a denarius and hard labor, who is willing to work? Those who need it to live, right? So those who are just trying to scrap by a living. There's a level if you're just a laborer and you're hanging around the marketplace for hours and hours and hours just hoping someone will pick you up. There's a feeling of desperation. There is, if you're thinking of like power dynamics, there's an issue of I have no power and I'm hoping somebody powerful will help me out, right? What's that? Humility, yeah. Especially those guys who hang out for 11 hours. I think in our human eyes, we would look in and see the person who hung around the marketplace for 11 hours and we would think, that guy's an idiot. You could have at least made yourself useful at home, right? And instead, as we're thinking, that guy's dumb. Why would you hang around? Clearly nobody wants you. You're not good enough to work. The master not only eventually brings you in the vineyard, but pays you the same. And we're thinking, interesting. I don't know what to make of that. So there's a level of humility. Somebody saying, I got nothing to lose. I don't know what else to do. So let's talk about maybe who these types of people are. So I think most scholars are in complete agreement that the first people into the vineyard are the Jews. And I think it's not a stretch to say that these are the Jews that along the way have followed John the Baptist, and they've come to the conclusion that Jesus is their Messiah. And there's an inkling of them that recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. But also, I bear the covenant through the circumcision. I have a family tree that I can trace back thousands of years. I can quote the Old Testament backwards and forwards and forwards and backwards. And so even though I'm in the field with some other people, I'm a little bit better than them. Does that make sense? Because we've been at this thing looking for the Messiah for much longer than Mr. 1 hour work guy. Does that make sense? Okay? And then there's these others. I think these are just various people who have jumped on along the way. And I think the last one is just the pure Gentile convert. Now, like I said, if you continue reading the New Testament, it would be really awesome if you said these two groups just get together, they sing Kumbaya, they love each other, they never have any issues. But when you have thousands of years of history hating another group that all of a sudden you're supposed to just sing Kumbaya with, it doesn't quite work that way, does it? And so there's issues. So what is Jesus teaching kind of at the core of this? What would you say if you had to sum it up into one sentence? What is this parable about? Yeah.
Grace is given by God not based on your works or when you come to faith.
Okay, so grace is maybe not time dependent. Okay, it doesn't depend on time. How many of you would say you believe that to be true? Oh yeah, grace doesn't depend on time or works. Yeah, that's a big one. Okay, how many of you would say that I 100% agree with this? Just, we'll talk about like in reality and how we operate in a second, but just in your mind, you read that and say, yeah, I believe that. You know, we say things like, you've probably experienced this, maybe somebody is in their last days, right? And you're thinking, I really just want to pray over them. I want to read them God's word on their deathbed, and I'm just praying that they would receive Jesus. How many of you would say you've been part of that or you've prayed for that to happen before? And the idea is all they have to do is accept Jesus and they are going to go to heaven, right? So that is the thought experiment and the real life example that we believe this. How about a time where maybe in reality our actions don't really show that we would believe this? All the time? You got an example?
Well, I just feel like the Christian walk is kind of, you're always trying to do things that God is calling you into. So you're always feeling like, well, me personally, I feel like I have to do things that the Lord wants me to do. Adjust my life to doing the works that He has called me into,
Yeah.
But that doesn't give me grace, It's really what I've purchased with a price, right?
So it's a slippery slope to slip into, I've been doing a lot for you, God.
Yeah.
Guilty. Totally guilty. I've looked back in time and thought like, oh, where along the line did it go from just generous, this is what God is calling you into, to God, you got a blessing? Or like the disciples, you got a throne for me to sit on? Right? We're going to get there in a second. Not only do the disciples want that, but they told their mom, and their mom is like, I'm going to knock down the door. I'm helicopter mom. I'm going to ask him for the best thrones in the house. Yeah, Chester.
So I think there's two really good examples in the Bible that kind of demonstrate this. One is the Prodigal Son Story. So the prodigal son leaves and comes back, and the father is very happy that he's back and throws a party. The prodigal son's brother is like,
not so happy.
It's not working for me. Like I'm doing the work, and he's off partying, and he doesn't deserve the same thing that I deserve, and yet you're giving it to him.
Yeah.
I think it's exactly the same attitude as here, right?
Or it's even more extreme because his example is, you don't so much as give me like a lamb to celebrate with my friends. I don't even get like equal, I get less. Right?
And then the story of the thieves on the cross, it's a thief that accepts the sacrifice that's being made in front of him, has done nothing to merit eternal salvation at all in his entire life.
Yeah.
And yet in the last moment of his life, he's going to receive it because, like the 11th hour people that went into the field, he recognized the benevolence of the master and therefore received what he didn't deserve. Right?
I had forgotten about that, but his question is, please remember me.
Right.
And he says, today you'll be with me.
Right. Your point about the Jews is they feel that their works are more valuable than the works of the Gentiles.
Yeah.
Right? They have more value. And just like the people that have been in the field all day, they think the value of their works merits more consideration.
Yeah.
That's what they think is the value of their works. And that's the problem with thinking like that, is that none of our works merit salvation.
Yeah.
The grace of God, lest any of us should boast, that gives us eternal salvation. And that's really ultimately what it comes down to. And you're just as deserving as if you went into the field at the beginning or the end. God's mercy is giving you your reward.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I was thinking a bit about this because if sometimes we read these stories and we feel like, wow, that's a big teaching. But if we've been paying attention, it's so difficult to read this document over, we're going to be about a year, and realize that all these themes are woven all over the place. Jesus has already taught this. He already taught them that, hey, you might say that you have Abraham as your father. I just want to let you know I can turn rocks into sons of Abraham. Like, that's irrelevant. That doesn't count. It's not like on your report card where you get to start off in a higher grade or something like that. He's been teaching these things all along the way. Very interesting. I think I was thinking about this, and I actually had this thought, this full confession session. I had this thought a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. I was preaching, or I was getting ready to preach, and one of the things I do is I try to prepare as much as I can, think out an outline, and then it's at that point that I sometimes will go on YouTube and just look at another sermon. I never want to do that first, but I often just see, I wonder what other people have said. Maybe there's a theme that I totally missed that I should have picked up on, and I didn't. And so I typed in the scripture. It was Exodus, I can't remember which chapter it was. And one of the ones that came up, I clicked on, and this honest, sinful confession. I saw the person come up on the screen, and I thought, oh, way too young. I have no interest in listening to this. For real. I felt this deep conviction, I'm sure 90% of the church you work at thinks that about you every time you stand up there. But I thought, why is that your response? Right? Shouldn't the response be just go with eyes closed, listen to the content, and then prayerfully consider, is this God's word to you? Instead of, oh, this guy hasn't been in the field long enough to get paid the real thing. I want to find somebody who clearly, by somehow my human sight, could pick up by looking at someone that they're worth listening to. I think that we do that. I think this is maybe a word of warning. I think there's really good news. Like we said, this is about if you went in the field at the 11th hour, the master in this parable is the greatest boss of all time, right? On day one, man, I work for the most generous guy. So there's good news packed in here. There's also maybe not bad news, but I think there's a word of warning to people who see themselves as the spiritual firsts. That's what I started calling it in my outline. And I think that we can see, obviously, that maybe this is a Jewish problem, right? Only the Jews would have a problem with that. But I think I've seen this, and I was in youth ministry a long time, and we have to be very careful, for instance, of say a 14 or a 15-year-old comes to faith, and they are talked down to, or with a condescending tone, oh, yeah, it's so awesome that you just received Jesus. Just wait until you hit the trial season, right? And it's almost like this poo-poo on the excitement and the energy. And, we have to be very careful about that. Because what we have to come to grips with is the grace that they just received 10 minutes ago is sufficient for them, and it's the exact same grace that God has given us. And so I think that's the warning to people who feel I've been doing this a long time. Oh, it's great to have you in the field. Let me tell you about the good old days when we used to work in the heat of the sun, and you're just working, it's already sun almost down. It's real convenient for you. You're not even breaking a sweat. Let me tell you about breaking a sweat in the old days, right? We got to be careful about that kind of thing. I think the last thing is this is at the core of what Jesus is teaching. What it means for the first to be last and the last to be first is, I don't think it's this ranking system of who is best and who is worst. I think what Jesus is saying is that the unmerited, undeserved grace is so abundant and so overflowing that all people that come to confess Jesus as the Lord will receive it fully. That the order will not matter if you come to that conclusion. I think that's what Jesus is trying to say. I think the last thing that I wrote down here is that this is part of the question that Peter had. It's what's in it for us, more or less, was his question. I think what we would say that the Bible teaches about the people first in the vineyard is that there are things that they got that others don't get. I think the disciples pick up on that and they understand that. But what they think it is that it's more pay. I think what Jesus would say it is it was the opportunity for you to be shaped and chiseled and polished to be more and more like Jesus, and that comes through hard work and time. That was your gift. Your gift was the long-form discipleship of following Jesus. That's what you've been paid, and you've been paid that based on the amount of work that you've put into it. At the end of the day, do you get a bigger house, a bigger car because you've been following Jesus longer? No. Is it true, not all the time, but is it true that people who follow Jesus for many years and do it diligently often have more wisdom than those who just started? Absolutely. Is that a gift of God to you? Absolutely. We should take that seriously. But it doesn't mean that those who are in the vineyard first somehow are going to get a bigger paycheck at the end of the day. Yeah, please.
And also, that blessed assurance, that security, those first guys in the field knew that they were going home like that. So they had that peace.
Oh, I didn't think of that.
You know,
So they're working all day knowing full well at the end of this day I will get what was I agreed to. Yeah, so I like that. That's a song, right? Blessed Assurance.
yeah, it's one of my favorites. Yeah.
I'm cat's out of the bag. A lot of people I don't really listen to modern Christian music. I have hymn playlists, and people make fun of me for it, but I know it well. I like that song. There's a question here. I want to keep pushing forward, but I would really encourage you to put a star next to this and maybe set some time aside to consider this. The last thing I'll say is just I think I kind of want to repeat it in a different way. I think part of the beauty and the gift of our church here, and I don't know if you know this, but there are other pastors that will come through here or people who will say certain things. One of the first things they always say is how hard it is and how big of a blessing it is that we are a multi-generational church. That oftentimes when people plant a church, the planting team is usually oftentimes it's all one age. And so what the phenomenon is how do you pastor everyone between 25 and 40? That's the whole thing, right? So people say, wow, what an absolute blessing that you have. And I was thinking one of the things that we do at our very best is that when kids come to faith or they get baptized or one of these monumental things happen, is that we don't speak down to them. My experience at this church is that we don't. That young people not only are free to live into who God created them to be, but I feel like this church is really good at capturing their energy and saying I want to ride that wave with you. So I just want to say that as a word of encouragement, just to keep pushing into that. Okay, so this next story begins in verse 17. This is as your heading, which by the way is not in the original Bible, but gives us kind of an idea of what's to come. Sometimes I think that's not good for us because I think sometimes, especially Matthew and Mark, they kind of want to pump fake you, slam on the brakes, change gears, and go in a different direction on purpose. And I don't think they would have been really cool with the spoiler ahead of time. I think they would have wanted you to read. But my heading says, Jesus foretells his death a third time. And when I read that, I thought, oh, I should probably know exactly what the first two ones were, and maybe there's some comparison and contrast. It turns out there absolutely is. There's a footnote. Basically, every time, now the third time Jesus predicts it, he's becoming more and more specific. So the first time he just simply says, we're going to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer many things, and I'm going to be killed. That's all he says, just very generic. There it is. The second time comes in chapter 17. He says on the third day he's going to be raised to life. So that's the new addition. So you already know he says I'm going to be killed, but on the third day I'm going to be raised again. So he's adding these things. This time, as we're going to see, he gets in to some specific detail. So let me get a swig of water here and then we're going to read it. Okay. If you're taking notes, I didn't know this, but apparently it's kind of a conclusion that many Bible scholars have come to. That this story is kind of the conclusion of, you could put it this way, this is what happens to the master of that vineyard. This is what happens when you tell authority people who feel like they're in positions of power and prestige, that they get paid the same as the beggar that was found in the marketplace at the very end of the day. And as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, "See "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death." Okay, so he's already said this before. This is the third time they've heard this part. This is the first time they've heard this part, though. "And they will deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified." Very specific and in order. "And he will be raised on the third day." So the new details that Jesus has let them know is that the chief priests, the religious leaders, are going to hand him over to the Gentiles. They're going to mock, flog, and crucify him. Okay. I was thinking about this a bit. And I was caught up in, have you ever talked to somebody who believes Jesus is like a real historical person, but they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God? You guys have met people like that before? So I think one of the common narratives that goes along with that, and I don't know if it's because people actually believe this or they are trying to be peaceful in conversations with a Christian or a pastor, but they'll say, yeah, it seems like Jesus was such a wonderful teacher and moral guy, and he really helped people like live into a calling in their life, and he got mixed up with the wrong political leaders, and they killed him. And I was reading that this week, and it dawned on me, like, that's not true at all. Even if you don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, that is not the truth, because throughout the book of Matthew, Jesus has been very clear that what is going to happen to him is not an accident. It's not something he accidentally walked into and he got caught up in the wrong crowd and they got him. He's been saying this is not only the plan since he's been teaching. The New Testament says this was the plan from the foundations of the earth. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that's not the picture of Jesus at all. He full well knows where he's going. He's submitting himself to it. And on his way to Jerusalem, he predicts his death again. A couple interesting notes. This idea that Jesus just adds in there that he's going to be kind of turned over to the chief priests and the elders. They're going to, let's see, I don't want to misquote it. He'll be delivered over to them. They are going to condemn him to death, and then they're going to hand him over to the Gentiles to do the killing. Many of you probably know this, but it's an important detail. Jews in the Roman Empire do not have permission whatsoever to carry out the death penalty on people. Did you guys know that? The Jews can say, like, we think somebody is worthy of death, but they're not allowed to kill somebody. Why is that? Do you know? It's because Rome has a monopoly on violence and killing, yeah. I won't even write it. Yeah, Rome has the absolute monopoly on it. And why do they have the monopoly on it? Is it because they're dumb or they're really smart at the core? If your goal is to build the largest empire in the entire world, are you going to have people who aren't going to like it? Do you need a tool to control the masses? We've talked about some of their tools. For instance, they would flood the bread market. Did I already tell you this before? I learned this like in the last year. They would flood the bread market, basically put bakers and people out of business, and then take the bread away. And then say, yeah, we do have bread. That's true. We'll actually give it to you for free because we are so benevolent. But we're going to need you to turn your behavior around, right? They would literally starve people and manipulate them with their sustenance, which is terrible. But the other thing that they did, and they're very famous for it, they had a monopoly on violence, and they did not hesitate to use violence. And they let all the minority groups know, as long as you pay taxes, you acknowledge Caesar is God, we'll leave you relatively alone. But you're not allowed to kill anyone. That's our business. So Jesus lets them know that ultimately there's something going on as he goes to Passover in Jerusalem where the Roman military is going to get involved. And he will be raised on the third day. One thing that I just absolutely love, and I love to humanize and think of Jesus this way, I love that it keeps saying they're going up to Jerusalem. In your Bible, you could even flip there, Psalms, I think it depends on your version. I think it's like 119 or 120. If you flip there, actually I'm going to flip there in my Bible. Give me 1 second. I want to make sure ESV says this. Should start at 120. So if you go to Psalm 120. Wow, 119 is very long. Okay. Mine says, deliver me, O Lord. And then the next line says, a song of ascent. Does yours say song of ascent? This is the songbook of ascending up to Jerusalem. This is quite literally the songs that Jesus and his disciples sang, because all the Jews pilgrimaging for the 3 big festivals in Jerusalem, as they went up the mountain, I want to say Jericho, somebody who's been there, Jericho is like way below sea level, I think, right? It's like 700-800 feet below sea level. Jerusalem, I think, is like 2,600. And it's only like 25 miles apart, so we know that Jesus is in or around Jericho, and he's going up to Jerusalem. And he is 100% a faithful Jew. He grew up in the culture. He and the disciples sang these 12 psalms, 120 or 14, 120 through 134. They knew these and they sang them. Isn't that crazy? So if you read these tonight, these are words that Jesus sang. You guys aren't impressed? I just think it's so cool. You're like, interesting, cool, what else you got? The internet has made nobody impressed whatsoever with anything. Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to mention.
Yeah, please.
When he does this, when he tells them about this, he's just talking to the 12.
Yeah.
When he gave the other parable and stuff, he was talking to all of the disciples, which we don't know how many there were. But,
Yeah.
But in this, it specifically says he took the 12 aside and told them.
Oh, good catch. Yeah, so if you didn't hear Wanda, what she's saying is she's pointing out that this teaching, he just taught a whole group this parable. Now this teaching is just for the 12. Yeah. I think there's an element also of, we just learned about God saying he's so abundant in grace, but I think there's an element of like the tangible grace. That you got these 12 guys, they're young guys, they've been following Jesus, and whether they fully get it or not, I think that you can look back in time and say Jesus is trying to protect them. He's trying to protect them not from averting what he's called to do, but protect them by letting them know, hey, this is going to happen. You know what I mean? Like, they're going to be emotionally distraught. They're going to be devastated. They're going to be confused. And there's actually a moment where the lights turn on and they say, this is what he said was going to happen. You remember that? I think it's when he's walking the road to Emmaus and they don't realize who he is, right? And then they say, when he disappears, they say, oh my gosh, did not our hearts burn within us? And then they realize, oh, he taught us this already. He's trying to tell them. And I think that's like a tangible piece of God's grace of, I'm trying to spare you something, but your eyes are not open. So I think the last thing I want to say is that this word is a terrifying word. Oh, losing a pen. In the Roman world, this is a terrifying word. I think I've maybe mentioned this a few times in various places, but a crucifixion in the Roman world is a giant billboard. That's what it is. It's a giant billboard where people were crucified in heavily trafficked locations at high elevation where people in towns and cities could see. And the idea was, as you hang there, you are the billboard to everybody else of this is what happens when you mess with Rome. This is the most brutal, terrible thing. And these people are acting as a deterrent, a warning to anybody who would try to get in Rome's way. Now, I only say that. We're not there yet. Jesus is not being crucified. We'll talk more about it. But when Jesus says to the disciples, I'm going there, I'm going to be mocked, flogged, and crucified, we know as we're reading that they are not paying attention. They've already made up their mind of what Jesus is going to do because, like, the red alert alarm bells don't go off. They don't think like, whoa, wait a second, we haven't heard that part before. What are you talking about? Crucified? That's a big, big, nasty thing. Tell us about that. They don't do that. Matthew knows people would have freaked out when they heard that word and thought, oh boy, if you've never read Matthew before and now he's saying this, what is your thought? Oh geez, this is going to get ugly, right? Instead, Matthew says this in verse 20. Then the mother of Zebedee came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, asked him for something, and he said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom. My sons told me that you let them know that something in your kingdom, they're each going to have a throne, and that's cool. They can all 12 have thrones, but can my boys have the best ones, right? Vice president, and what's third in line after vice president? Huh? Speaker of the House, that's right. Lord, bless our country. So he says, I love this, what do you want? And she's jockeying for position, and Jesus answered, you do not know what you're asking for. You have no clue what you just said. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink? And they said to him, we are able. And he said to them, you will drink my cup. But to sit at my right hand and at my left hand is not mine to grant, but it is for those to whom it has been prepared by my Father. So a couple things, some interesting things going on here. Are you able to drink my cup? In the New Testament, what is the cup? It's the blood, the shed blood, which is the death, right? In Hebrew culture, the blood is what gives life, the breath of God plus the lifeblood, right? So the cup is this idea in the New Testament of, are you able to somehow take on my death? And they said, we are able, yep. And then Jesus, knowing what we know at the end of the story, I think these are the things that Matthew is putting in here in the story, and when we look back in time, we think, oh. You guys know the story of James. It's just kind of like tossed in there. He's one of the sons of Zebedee. In Acts chapter 12, what happens to him? He gets mixed up with Herod. And what does Herod do? He just kills him with a sword, right? And then it makes a note that the Jews were so happy with Herod, they were back on his good side. So was James, son of Zebedee, able to drink the cup? Yeah. Does he know what he's saying in this moment? Absolutely not. He doesn't know. What's interesting to me is it won't be long. I think it's Mark. Yeah, it's Mark. I put it in a footnote. Tradition is that the wife of Zebedee, so this woman, her name is Salome or Salome. Some people pronounce it. Salome. No, she's not Italian. Salome. Mark says that Salome is one of the women watching the crucifixion from a distance. She's this woman. She's James and John's mom. And I got to imagine that as she's watching that happen, some of what Jesus is saying to her right here is coming into full focus. And she is probably feeling devastated, maybe even a little bit embarrassed by what she asked. She's realizing this is not what I thought it was, maybe confused, but I find that fascinating. That's kind of a cross-reference because Matthew doesn't tell us that, but I think it's worth noting. So he says, are you able to drink the cup? We are able. They said, we are able. He said to them, you will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand is basically not up to me. It's up to my Father and who he's prepared those places for him. I think this is what the story is doing here, because I think there's some creative license that Matthew, we've said this so many times, has so many stories to choose from. He could still be alive and still be writing, right? So why did he write this story and make sure that it got in there? And why did he put it right in this very place? I'm sure there's something that happened in between. Why didn't he tell us more about that? I think what Matthew wants us to know is as Jesus approaches Jerusalem, the picture of what's going to happen to him is not getting clearer. It's not getting clearer. And not only that, but you know, like from the mouth of your mother, sometimes you hear like the interpretive version of what you said to her. You ever hear that? Like, for instance, I can imagine like maybe a sibling of mine saying something to my mom and then hearing it from my mom and maybe reading a little bit more behind it than she is. You know what I'm saying? I think what Jesus is getting and what Matthew is communicating to us is through the mouth of their mom, they've clearly had some conversations with their mom. And she's saying, jackpot. This is our chance to get out of that fishing village, right? Jesus, I know it's very bold of me, But can you give us some power? Can you give us a position? Can you give us some prestige? After all, remember, my sons told me they left everything to follow you, and you said there was going to be like some thrones involved and 100-fold and whatever that is. Can we just like bulk that into 2 positions right on your right and your left? And his response is, oh, you have no idea what you're talking about, and they have no idea what they're talking about based on what they've told you. And I think Matthew wants us to know that. Verse 24, when the other 10 heard it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers. Why were they indignant? Are they thinking, I can't believe you were so arrogant and prideful that you asked that? You think so?
Or like, shoot,
Or we've been thinking about how to ask also, right? Yeah, because you don't want to become like the vice transportation secretary, right? That's not the position you want. So they're indignant, right? By the way, did the 2 brothers do anything? Kinda. They talk to their mom about it, and then they have an abrasive mom. Is that on them? Is that their problem, right? I don't know. I got to imagine they told their moms, or they told their friends, right?
Maybe they asked their mom.
Maybe. Yeah, we're scared of him because he keeps telling us, like, you have no idea what you're talking about. Let me correct you in private. Maybe you could talk to them, Mom. I'm not getting any playing time on the freshman basketball team. Maybe you could talk to him, Mom.
Andy, in my footnotes in the Bible, it says that this Salome they say was the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. So maybe this was a relational.
It could be, yeah.
Hey, I want my cousins up there, on my right and on my left.
Mm-hmm.
We're family.
Yeah.
They should be put up there someplace. I mean, you're thinking, right? Because they were very tight-knit family, the Jewish people.
Yeah, I had read that it's possible that she's related to Mary. I think especially Jews in really small village towns that we're talking about, they all not only know their lineage like back in time, they know their current lineage. And they're all kind of related in some way, like a third cousin, or they know the connection. But it's totally, completely possible. Yeah. Okay, so when the 10 heard it, they were indignant. But Jesus called them, so all 12. This is not those 2 guys' problem. This is an all y'all problem. So he calls the 12 to him, and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and that their great ones exercise authority over them. So basically, they force others into submission of their power. It shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. What does that sound like? Whoever wants to be first shall be last. You see, Matthew has not dropped it. He still wants to know, what does that mean? That's so central to Jesus' teaching. Matthew has not dropped it. He's still explaining it. Whoever would be great among you, whoever would wish to be first, must become the servant. The word for servant and slave is the exact same word, by the way. And whoever would be first among you shall be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. I think there's just something really simple going on. I think Jesus is contrasting the way the world has basically taught everyone how leadership and authority work. And so this is the world. How has the world taught us that leadership works? The first shall be first, right? Just think of, let's just think of like a business atmosphere, right? The person who's been promoted to the top is the supervisor over people below, right? We don't even contest that. In a lot of ways, I don't think Jesus is speaking directly to that. I don't think Jesus has a problem with that. But in our mind, it creeps into, if that person has a title above me, that person is in charge of me, right? That's how the world works. So we have words like boss, supervisor. We have people who tell you what to do, and they're the person who sits in the authority while you do your job review or whatever you call it, right? And now Jesus says, that's not how it's supposed to be for you. How is it to be for you? So this is how leadership works in the kingdom. And he says, you don't have to guess because I've already showed you how it works. How does it work? Serve. So much so that you become like a slave. This is tough because we come preloaded with baggage about what that means. But in the ancient world, that's not the same connotation. The connotation is that a good slave in the ancient world has one singular focus, and that's to do what? To serve. To serve. To anticipate what people need before they even say anything. To have things ready before they even ask for it, right? That's the idea. So Jesus says, if you're curious what it looks like to be a slave, look at me. Even as the Son of Man came, not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's powerful stuff. So I would say, whether we like it or not, we live in this world. This is how the world acts, right? I think if you're in a position where you've been promoted or you're in charge of people, I don't think Jesus is saying, oh, whatever, you should ask for a demotion. You should ask, can you just demote me all the way to the bottom? I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. I'm saying what Jesus is saying is you should be known, your authority should be known by how you treat people, how you serve them, how you're willing to, as he would say, the law says you should carry someone's pack a mile, you should carry it 2 miles, right? Not because this is like a check box and God is up there saying, oh, Andy, 6 out of 10, right? Oh, Jimmy does a lot of good stuff, 9 out of 10. Like, that's not what's happening. It's not a score sheet. We've been at this all the way since Matthew chapter 5. That's the foundation of all of it. Where does this stuff come from? It comes from your heart. It starts at the moment of faith, and the seed grows in your heart, where this is not something you do, it's something you are. A slave is not something you do. A slave is something you are. Does that make sense? Jesus says, you want to have authority, you want to have power, you want to be somebody with authority and power in the kingdom while living on the earth. This is how you do it. You become someone so service-minded that you don't even think about it. It just becomes who you are. Okay. This story is why I just felt like we absolutely had to go through the whole chapter, because I want you to see how funny this is, okay? I think that sometimes the humor and the brilliance of the Bible gets lost. There is something beautiful about the, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but you come into church and there's this sense of like holiness and you're going to encounter God, and I love that. But I think sometimes in the midst of those environments, we miss out on the humor that the Bible is trying to tell us. So let's just review really quick. So here are the sequence of the stories. Okay, we had this first shall be last, last shall be first thing going on, and people are like, well, what's that? So Jesus teaches about the master, and it ends in conflict, like people are frustrated and upset about this is how it works, right? The very next story is that Jesus predicts his death, and he even uses the trigger word crucifixion, and it doesn't trigger them. We know it doesn't trigger them because the very next story is like, hey, could we get some kickbacks? Could we get some position? Could we get some power, right? The whole idea is Jesus is not hiding. He teaches a parable, right? And then parable over, I am going to Jerusalem. Copy? I am going to be crucified. That will be the way they put me to death. You remember that thing? Yes. Copy? Yes. They don't get it. And Matthew chooses to tell us this as the very next story. And as they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed them. And behold, there were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. And when they heard Jesus was passing by, they cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. Okay, this is awesome. This is so cool. Where is Jesus going? He's going to Jerusalem. what is Jerusalem? The city of David, right? What do Jews believe in the first century? Rome is kind of taking them captive. What do they want? They want freedom. They want the city of David to have what in it again? A king, right? How often has Matthew, in your recollection, has Matthew used the phrase son of David a lot or a little? A little. Okay, so if we were just sitting reading the whole thing in one sitting, this would be like, I haven't heard that too much. Who recognizes Jesus going to Jerusalem, the city of David, and calls him out for who he is? A blind guy. So who gets it? 2 blind guys get it. How do they get it? Why do they get it? Have they seen anything he's done? Nope, they haven't. It sounds harsh. They haven't seen anything, right? Have they heard some things? Probably. At this point, probably. Have what they heard led them to the conclusion that we don't even know what he looks like? Don't have a clue. Heard some rumors. And rumors are good enough for us because we have put our faith in him, so much so that we recognize him as the king that should be sitting on the throne in that city. So in all the story, the disciples, comprende disciples, right? Death, Jerusalem, get it? 1 + 1 = 2, and they're like, can we have a throne when you get your kingdom thing? And he's like, oh my gosh. Then their mom comes, like, hey, we heard some cool stuff. Would it be cool if my son sat? He's like, you have no idea what you're asking. And then what's the very next story? 2 blind guys who can't even see shout from a distance, Lord, have mercy on us, son of David. They get it. I think Matthew wants you to know this is hilarious. This is very funny. The crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent, but they cried out all the more, Lord, have mercy on us, son of David. Can you think of anyone else the disciples have been rebuking? Children. And what did Jesus say about children? Let them come to me. It's ones like this that the kingdom belongs to, right? They get it. So what is the kind of the flip-flop? The people doing the rebuking are the ones who don't get it. The ones trying to protect Jesus from the blind guys, like, hey guys, like if you wanted a miracle done, that was like so 3 weeks ago. We got a mission. We're going to Jerusalem. Some stuff's going down. Snooze you lose. Should have been down in the Jordan 3 weeks ago, man. Stay back, be quiet, right? They're the ones who don't get it. And all it does is it just makes them yell louder. We know who you are. You're the son of David. Can you just have mercy on us? Were you going to say something, Chet?
Yeah, I think it says that they sat, the blind men were sitting by the roadside, and I think they were there every day.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, kind of like an old school beggar.
The blind person's hearing is more attuned with what's really going on. And so everybody that's walking by, they're hearing the stories of everybody that's walking by, coming and going. Did you hear what Jesus did? Did you hear about this blind guy? Did you hear about this life raised from the dead? They're hearing all this stuff. And so then when they hear that he's coming, or that he's there, they're thinking, this is our chance. Nobody's going to stop me.
Yeah.
You know, so then they jump up. And then the disciples tell them to shut up.
Yeah.
So they just shout all aloud.
I think it's awesome. As you were saying that, it was like, this is like a very spiritual kind of interpretation, but maybe there's something about seeing that is not good. Sometimes you look at the world and you think like, oh, and it becomes more of a hindrance on your faith than a good thing. Anybody ever watched the news before? Ever? Like in your entire life? And you watch it and you think like, man, I know God is good. I know God has a plan, but man, it's not looking good, right? The odds are getting stacked against you more, God. I don't know if you've been noticing, right? But then, like, even in my own life, I feel like when I go back to God's Word, it's more of like, yeah, I'm reading and I see words on a page, but it's more like listening to what God says. and it's almost like speaking life back into you. I think there's something spiritual about these guys haven't seen how bad the world is. They've heard it, it's enough for them. They come to faith. So he says, now listen, this is the same question in Greek. It's the same exact question he asks the wife of Zebedee. What do you want? What do you want me to do for you? Interesting, right? Now, when he asked her that question, what was her answer?
Set my kids up.
Set us up, right? Now he asks the guys who get it. Now, these are people who get it. This is the kind of stuff they ask for. Lord, let our eyes be opened. Now, in kind of New Testament language, what does it mean for your eyes to be opened? What's that? Okay, to be able to see physically, but also there's an element of understand, right? I think we talked about this. Now, if you went back, I think it's in chapter 9, almost the exact same thing. The first people, I think, I could be wrong on this, but I think the first people in the book of Matthew to call Jesus the Son of David are two other blind guys. And he heals them, and he says, whatever you do, don't go tell everyone. And the first thing they do is they run off and tell everyone, right? And we talked about this back then, that part of their physical healing comes as a result that they already can see. They can't physically see, but spiritually they already see. In fact, spiritually they see more clear than just about everyone that we've read about so far, right? I think Chester had the, what is the woman, the crumbs off the table? Where is she from again? I'm so sorry. Tyre and Sidon, somewhere in there. She's one of the ones who sees, right? She's one of the ones that understands. There's a Roman centurion who understands, but there's very few people who totally get it. These guys already spiritually see. And as a result of their faith of spiritually seeing, they say, what do you want me to do? Lord, let our eyes be opened. And Jesus in pity, that word in Greek is not as negative as it sounds. It sounds like, oh, he took a pitiful state. It's more loaded with the same word as like compassion. He sees that they're suffering, and so his pity is more of a compassionate pity. He touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight. I made a note here, and I couldn't find anything at all, but I thought the word recovered was interesting. It looks like that's literally what it means, which leads me to believe, is it possible maybe they weren't always blind, or I don't know. I first read it and thought, oh, maybe they could see and then they became blind, and then I read it again and thought, I think it can be either, but just a thought. They received their sight, and what did they do? They followed him. It's kind of an interesting time to follow Jesus, isn't it? What they're going to physically see with their eyes at the tail end of this is going to be a devastating thing. I think the big thing is that they recognize Jesus as the king on his way to the throne. As we wrap up tonight, would somebody just volunteer to pray over us, and we'll exit?